Hello, and welcome to another edition of Brussels Sprouts. I'm Andrea Kendall-Taylor.
And I'm Jim Townsend.
And we're so glad you can join us. Since the invasion of Ukraine, European states have taken major steps to rebuild their defense industrial bases, both to supply Ukraine and rebuild their own militaries. Europe has been spending heavily on defense since 2022, but the Trump administration's demand for European NATO members to take responsibility for the conventional defense of the continent has spurred further defense investments. Add the Trump administration's bellicose rhetoric around Greenland and public doubts about the reliability of the United States in NATO, and the dual challenges of a resurgent Russia and a wavering United States strengthens the push for European officials to contemplate further defense integration. As European states continue to rearm, in 2026, they face the prospect of rebuilding their militaries, supporting Ukraine, and deterring Russia with less U.S. support. The new year has already shown a propensity for the unexpected, so to help us take stock of the way ahead for European security in 2026, we are excited to welcome Sophia Besch and Christian Molling to Brussels Sprouts. Sophia and Christian, welcome.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Typical intros. So Sophia Besch is a senior fellow in the Europe program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and Christian Molling is the director of European Defense in a New Age, a Berlin-based think tank, and he's a senior advisor at the European Policy Center. Okay, so as always, I like to start these conversations a bit broad and really to help Brussels Sprouts listeners kind of step back and think about where we are in transatlantic relations. And so maybe we can start just with both of you reflecting on that question of where we are, both where you thought the alliance was coming into 2026 and where you think we are now in the aftermath of all of the Greenland rhetoric and these added tensions in the transatlantic relationship. Like, how would you describe where we were headed and where we are now?
I wrote a paper last year that was, we titled it Managing the Divorce, about, the future of the transatlantic or not transatlantic security relationship. I think that paper and all the thesis about that and the need for a European way of war still holds true, and more so than it was last year. Last year there was a little bit of reluctance. We got a lot of criticism from the diplomatic corps that you shouldn't name it this way, and we are not handing in the the divorce papers, etc., etc. And I answered, look, basically, Europe is sitting alone at the kitchen table, and our partner has left already. So these are all kind of self-reflections we are basically doing. This is not to say that I've been always right, but I think what we currently see is this divorce getting more speed from what is happening in the US and the inability of the Europeans to respond to it. And I guess the last point and the kind of the positive outlook is a good divorce being managed also can, you can have a good, sober relationship, or possibly it is something that over time can come together again. But for the moment, I think it's pretty clear, or it's necessary to be pretty honest about what the current state of affairs is. And it's the worst, I guess, that we have seen since, decades back in the Cold War.
Yeah. Sophia, agree, disagree, reframe?
Yes, agree. I think we spent the first year of the Trump administration figuring out appeasement, flattery, trying to hug the administration close for lack of better options. I don't think that was a sign of any illusions on the part of the Europeans, but there is a clear distinction between trusting this administration and trusting in the transatlantic relationship and the need of having to continue to work with the administration in some fields, particularly obviously Ukraine is what is keeping us engaged. But the trust is gone. And we are now, I think, entering a new chapter. What I hope is happening is that we are beyond the day-to-day management of this relationship, building up European strengths, European capabilities for the future. And, the future is now. Building up European capabilities for now that we can no longer rely on the established transatlantic cooperation mechanisms. What we, in a piece with Leanna last year, we said that if you want to hug the United States, you need a strong spine. And I think we're investing into that European spine.
Well, thank you both. I'm so glad you're here at this time. This could be a great big therapy session if we let it. And I promise I will not do that in the past. But let me ask you, Sophia, particularly based on what you just said, if I were in the Kremlin and I began to see actual credible, and which is true, actual credible efforts, money being made to, as quickly as possible, kind of build that spine. And we'll talk about this later. I mean, every nation is going at a different speed in terms of their contribution to that spine. But if I were in the Kremlin and I was watching this happening, do you think that will speed up his kind of Putin's decision making in terms of if he has something in mind, about reclaiming part of ancient Russia, over and above Ukraine? Do you think that would accelerate his timeline? That this is something he certainly notices and he thinks it's credible, or does he dismissively look on this as piglets? Remember, he said this Europe is nothing but piglets. Or do you think he really thinks that it's piglets and he's not so worried about that? Where do you think Putin's mind is when he looks at Europe and sees all this action happening?
Well, I wish I knew where Putin's mind was. I'm not going to claim that I do, but I do think that his calculation clearly isn't working out. I think that his attack has led to a completely unprecedented rearmament in Europe. I think that rearmament is credible, and I think that is going to, in the medium to long term, lead to Europe that is much stronger, and that is a much bigger problem for Russia than it was in the past. Obviously, Jim, you put your finger on the critical issue, which is the timeline issue. So that is what is one of the things that Europe is missing right now is just time to make this all happen. We all wish it had started decades ago, this process, and we can talk about the details of this. And obviously that puts, if you want to, in this sort of deterrence dynamic, puts some pressure on Russia to maybe preempt the European efforts. I would say that right now, I think deterrence is still fairly strong, European deterrence of any Russian attack on European territory. The US is a critical factor here. More open and obvious divisions inside NATO, a US that, takes out critical assets on intelligence and air defense.
On a quicker time scale, maybe, before Europe has a chance.
Yeah, but let's continue down that path. I mean, that's the critical question, right, of 2026 is how credible are the promises of European leaders to rebuild European capabilities and on what timeline? And so maybe let's start to pick that piece apart. And again, starting from the very kind of big, broad picture. Christian, we can start with you, but Sophia, I know you've just put out a report on a similar topic, so hear your thoughts from both of you. Where are we on that really critical question? Are Europeans taking real concrete steps to rebuild that spine? Are we beginning to see the kind of political pronouncements translate into tangible actions? How would you categorize where we are on that? And it gets to the credibility point. Are the pronouncements of European leaders credible? Are they translating words into dollars and real capabilities?
I think there is maybe start with this. There is an imbalance, which is pretty obvious, and that's kind of rule of thumb. The closer you are to the Russian border, plus if you have a history with Russia or the Soviet Union, the more you are afraid of getting back into this history, and the more you're willing to arm yourself, and that's pretty obvious. Plus, there's of course, a dimension of fiscal space that is available, which is in some countries, especially in France and in the UK, not that much available, which makes them not look smaller, but just not as, so capable to ramp up defense than the others basically are doing. At the same time, you see there is a big figures with regards to the percentage of GDP, which is still for small countries. And if we are looking from Berlin eastwards, most of the countries are smaller, much smaller. It's in real terms of defense capability, it's not that much. There is an inner European dependency on the Western Europeans that still remains. And I guess the critical factor is very much on the political side, also for what is happening in Eastern Europe. So can you bind this all together into a European, however you want to call it, governance system? So a European NATO, some call it that way, which would imply a political governance as well as a military governance and a military command structure, right? That's the biggest problem that we currently have. That is all in NATO, which I think has been for a long time the right place. But with NATO becoming, or the future of NATO being unclear, and the question is whether the US will play a cooperative divorce or a kind of a hostile divorce, really makes the difference to, can the Europeans pull the weight that they have, or is the sum of the parts basically not available for the defense of Europe? Sorry if this has been too complicated, but I think that's there's still a lot of question marks in a time where so many changes happen in parallel, where and this is one historical thing I would like to point out, coming back also to Putin. What is historical currently is the development of different security spaces. There was a long-standing conviction that between the US and Europe, there shouldn't be security should always be the same. We're currently seeing that this is changing. So there are two spaces with different security guarantees, if you want to. And that is historical. And the question is, what does Putin do out of this? Because the assumption on the Russian side was always, if we are able to split the Americans from the Europeans will be weaker, which is in principle right. But now as the Europeans are ramping up, it's basically getting more complicated in the equation for the Russians as well to understand what is happening. Plus also the question of, will Trump possibly nonetheless come back? Just to disturb Putin and to disturb possibly also Xi, to help the Europeans to a certain extent if they are getting under more pressure from the Russians.
Let me try to address maybe that same question from a 40,000 foot view. I think that we've talked about the state of European defense for a long time as a state of Europeans asleep at the wheel. And if I continue with that metaphor, I think they're very much awake at the wheel, but they found themselves at the wheel of a plane in midair that they're needing to build while flying through a storm, right? And I think for what is on the positive side of the ledger right now is that the money is there. Not everyone is spending the same amounts, sure, but the most important country, Germany, is spending a lot of money. And that makes up for at least some of the fiscal constraints of European member states. The political will is there, the understanding is there. I think there's been a huge cultural shift towards needing to invest more in defense. Many taboos have been broken down, both at a national level and at a European level. What's not there yet, and if I try to stick with the metaphor, which is always risky on a podcast, but what's not there yet is the joint plan, right? I don't think there's a European plan yet for how to build this plane. This is the governance question that Christian was referring to. Broadly, the options on the table are NATO, are the EU, or are regional coalitions. My concern is that what we're seeing is a real national push and renewed fragmentation, spending decisions that are being made right now that are going to determine the scope of the industrial base for the next decade or more, are reinforcing fragmentation. We know that as budgets rise, collaboration declines, and the risk is that we are going to spend huge amounts of money over the next 15 years and then be just as dependent a decade from now as we are today because we're not investing in the right things. We're not investing in European capabilities. We're not investing in innovation. There are a couple of real structural constraints: the fragmented supply chain, the nationally fragmented markets, the divided capital market at a European level. Mario Draghi talks about all of this and what it means for Europe's struggle to unlock its innovative potential. But without the US's quasi-hegemonic role in European defense, we are left at a point where we don't know yet still how to fill that vacuum. I think that NATO, for all its worth, is currently incapable of discussing Russia and Ukraine inside the alliance. And we just have to state that that means that it cannot be in the leadership of European defense right now. The EU is improvising defense industrial policy in real time, but faces a real lack of political buy-in, a real lack of money, a real lack of effective decision-making procedures. Honestly, when you go to Berlin and other capitals right now, the EU barely ever comes up when you talk to defense policy planners, which is a problem. I think there's a lot of great ideas, a lot of momentum in Brussels, but it's just not translating to the capitals. And so, there are things the EU can do on Ukraine, particularly through SAFE. But I do think there's more sort of pragmatic, bottom-up regional integration and cooperation happening now around capabilities, particularly in the north and in the east. The question is whether it's happening quickly enough.
Wow, I tell you what, so what you both said, and Sophia, particularly what you just said in terms of the European Union and Berlin and et cetera, is fascinating, and I agree with you because I see that too, but I thought it was just me, but you're confirming my worst feeling. I mean, I think there's a lot of people here in Washington, particularly, who look on the EU as being able to step right into the shoes, not of NATO, but into the shoes of organizing a European approach to dealing with defense rebuild. I'm not talking about a military structure, et cetera, but that the EU, don't worry, Jim, the EU is going to come in. They're going to organize all of this. They've got a great team in there. They're saying the right things. They're putting money towards it. They've got various institutions within the European Union that can organize this cooperative approach, assign the various members various kinds of capabilities so we're not duplicating and everyone's not making tanks and no one's making ammunition. The EU is going to sort it out. They're going to do it. And I think what you're saying, though, is closer to the truth in the sense that, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I think what we're seeing is that the EU is trying to, but the lack of political buy-in is really interesting. Is you would think that there would be a lot of political buy-in to the EU and a lot of pressure on them to get their act together by the nations. But if there's not even political buy-in, and maybe among the bureaucrats, if you will, within the EU, they're like saying, look, this isn't us, this is NATO. You can't throw this stuff on our plates after keeping us separate. So the political buy-in is a fascinating thing, that there's not the political buy-in. And I might have misunderstood you, so you can clarify that. But the second thing is, I do believe absolutely about the regional aspect of this. You look at the Nordic, Baltic, Northern European approach, you're seeing that coalition coming together. You're not seeing Greece and Italy necessarily, but Spain. You're not seeing a southern regional approach, or the South participating in the North, or you are seeing a fragmentation when it comes to a focus and development of capabilities, I think. And it's like Christian said, the closer to Russia, the more organized you are. And so it is fascinating that that's happening. And I think over the next couple of years, this can become more and more obvious unless the EU is successful in bringing everyone together. Sorry for talking too much, but Sophia, first you and Christian, what do you think about what I just said?
Yeah, no, I was nodding along. I do think that the challenge that the EU faces, and I want to try to be very nuanced in this, because I don't want to dismiss everything the EU is doing. I think they are doing useful things. I think they have become much more pragmatic over the last couple of years, particularly through issues like SAFE, for instance. They're essentially financing regional coalitions of the willing. They're dropping a lot of the protectionist ambitions that they had in the past. They are trying to attack a lot of the regulatory burden, where actually it's often not Brussels that's the problem, it's member states that's the problem. And so I don't want to engage in too much Brussels blaming. At the same time, I also don't think that the answer to all challenges is the EU. It could be on paper, but it just isn't in terms of what we're seeing in the reality of what is being built in the European defense ecosystem right now. I think one of the reasons is the lack of money still, is the difficulty in the decision-making structures, though I will say the EU is building all of this as we are advancing. They are becoming more effective in getting around vetoes. They are increasing their budgets, but it's just not here right now. The Commission is building up its expertise on defense industrial policy, but it hasn't been there in the past. It's never been able to really make its case. And, if you look at who is in Brussels' corner, who among the member states has a real interest in Brussels taking on this role, the smaller member states are worried that they're going to get crowded out because the bigger member states with mature defense industries are best positioned to capture EU funding. And at the same time, the larger producing states are reluctant to cede any decision-making authority to Brussels. You see this in Germany. They have all this new domestic funding, so why should we go through EU instruments? There you have this new Berlin machismo of we have all this money, like why should we do this at a European level? And so there's no one really who sees the selling argument of Brussels right now, with the exception, I would say, with something that I think is really useful is how the financial incentives and the regulatory incentives that the EU does lever, how that works to integrate Ukraine into Europe's defense industrial ecosystem through SAFE, for instance. I think that's a very, very useful mechanism.
Right.
Yeah, I think there is the kind of a real sense for the work pragmatic approach here, which could basically turn things around. So the European Union is a part of the equation of the reorganization of the kind of rebuild of the security order, not the rebuild, that's wrong, like a new security order. But the missing parts, Sophia mentioned Ukraine on the one hand. There is the UK, which is not part of the European Union and has been somewhat excluded, or there are regulatory burdens for them as well as psychological burdens. Norway isn't part. They are all kind of third countries, but this is a third country. It's not part of an alliance, so to say. Turkey is also out there. Some of the countries are very difficult to become part of a governance structure. To say this way, I wouldn't use the word integration. But I guess if there is a new security order in Europe which is serving kind of our interest, then it basically will have to manage all these different things, which means we can't build the perfect institution. We will have to work with all the kind of workarounds where I fully agree with Sophia. Commission has become more pragmatic. Sometimes there's kind of a hiccup of ambition again and institutional infights in Brussels, but I think that's pretty normal, right? We have that in our government, in our capitals as well. The big question out there is that enough? And I guess for the defense industrial restructuring, it's more of the same, right? It's the big member states, and they are, of course, especially Germany, because we are currently pumping out so much money into our own industry, and that will be the factor of restructuring. So we are building big centers of gravity with our national ramp up that will restructure the defense industrial supply chains in Europe, which means the big companies will integrate smaller companies. Whether that's a bad thing or a good thing, I don't know. It's definitely, friends of consolidation must be happy. Friends of competition can't be happy about this. And there you are. It's about a lot of choices. And the answer that is still missing is the question, so what is actually the model that you want for the future? Even if we would never achieve the ideal world, but what are we driving to? Because we're currently treating, if you sit in Europe, capitals or Brussels, doesn't matter, you get a mixture of the old world narrative, it's all about competition, defense is a normal market. And the New World things, which is it's all about speed, it's all about single sourcing. We don't go for a competition, we just go into contracts with the foreseeable consequence of underperformance, of scandals that will come out of this. And the question is, can you make that acceptable to political decision makers?
Yeah.
Also understanding that over time, this development has a higher potential of getting sore. So basically, if you have spent 4 years of money, a new government in Germany comes in and you have to justify what you have done with, 1 scandal, 5 scandals, 10 scandals, the magnitude of the money that has been wasted doesn't matter. It's just a bad impression that you give. I think that's the biggest risk that we are currently facing in this very dynamic development that we have in Europe.
I just wanted to, I agree with what Christian has said, and I just wanted to add in one last factor, which is the transatlantic defense-industrial relationship, where, of course, there are so many trends that are pulling us apart right now, and the listeners of this podcast will be familiar with them. We have different strategic priorities. We have a different assessment of Russia. We have a, frankly, overstretched U.S. defense industrial base that is not able to deliver as reliably and as quickly as it has been in the past. There are ITA concerns, all of that. At the same time, we face shared challenges as well, right? Both defense industrial bases are having to expand faster than at any point since the Cold War. We're both dealing with this issue between competition on the one hand, consolidation on the other hand. You have all these new entrants in the US market. You have the question in Europe whether we're able to strengthen new innovative entrants, or whether all the money will go to the old primes, whether they will be able to innovate in the same way. And so you kindly mentioned our paper, Andrea. I won't go into it too much, but we are trying, and I want to do this over the next years, to figure out a sort of more constructive vision for the future of the transatlantic defense industrial relationship that goes beyond this idea of a divorce in the defense industrial realm and a complete split of supply chains, which I don't think is realistic, but towards a more equal partnership on both sides of the Atlantic.
Yeah, it's that vision. I mean, Christian, you said the same thing. What are we driving towards? Sophia, you're getting that your remarks are on that same, in that same vein. We're going to have to figure out what it is we're driving towards and what that future relationship looks like. But let me take a slight turn just a little bit, and I want to delve into Germany, actually, just to hear a little bit more about what's happening. Before we started recording, we were talking about all of the tremendous changes that have taken place, the leadership from coming from Berlin. But at the same time, Germany is facing challenges, right? Chancellor Merz was kind of the poster child of the plan to seize the Russian frozen assets. That plan didn't go through. So there are questions about, although Germany and Merz himself is stepping up to the table and trying to assume a leadership role, that others haven't necessarily come along with him. So what does how would you characterize where Germany is currently? And this is a big question, talking a little bit about some of the changes domestically, particularly, as it relates to the defense industry, defense spending, and whether or not you think Germany can play a leadership role. If it's not coming from the EU only, is Germany going to be a key catalyst of the changes that you all are talking about?
Especially that last point.
Big questions. I buy you sometimes, Sophia. I guess the interesting thing is that Germany currently has a chancellor which is willing to take risks. And if you go back in time until, I don't know, the end of Cold War, I'm not sure how many risks chancellors have been taking before. Maybe Kohl with the decision for the reunification, but that was very much at the beginning of his government. So I think that's a good thing. So in times where more risky decisions are basically needed, because otherwise you can't improve, you can't innovate, etc., he's taking the risk with also the downsides. That is, sometimes he's taking the risk in a very impulsive way. But I think these two things are just two sides of the same coin, right? So I think that that's good. There is nonetheless, to the question of leadership, I think there is a kind of a natural limit in two ways, which is the power Germany has accumulated and can accumulate. Um, um, Also vis-a-vis our partners, are they willing to follow? Leadership always needs followers. If you're not kind of willing to basically coerce all your partners, which is Germany just doesn't have the power, plus I would say the cultural dimension, this leadership thing, which now everybody is talking about. Being a German, it just sounds strange, right? I guess if you take a look back, we always have been in the second line, more caring about sustainability of commitment than being the first one in the theater. And that is, I guess, it's changing a little bit due to Merz and due to the fact that others can't step up. If you take the French and the Brits, who would normally, at least rhetorically take the lead because of the domestic situation, they currently can't step up and punch above their weight as they have done for such a long time. As this is, again, a very new and dynamic situation, I wouldn't say that this type of leadership is sustainable for Germany alone, and also because of the domestic instability that we also have in Germany. So if you take a look around in Europe, you will see a lot of countries who have become less stable over the last 3 years, not due to the Ukraine situation, but just in parallel to that. And the question is, how do you govern this Europe then if it's getting more unstable and gets more right-wing at the same time, where cooperation is not the first point on the agenda, right? So I think this is really making things more difficult, no matter who tries to achieve or assume leadership.
So, I mean, if you put it in really stark terms, when we were going through the different models of how you could organize European defense in the future, the EU, regional, NATO, on paper, the leading defense power in Europe is going to be Germany. The budget so far outperforms the other leading powers. The ambitions, at least on paper, of Chancellor Merz are there. He said he wants Germany to become the leading conventional in Europe, the leading middle power. And middle power here is just the distinction to great power. Obviously, Germany is the middle power. Then if you look at the actual challenges that Europe is facing right now in the defense and security realm, if you look at Ukraine, for instance, the frozen assets, I would say that there are sort of the two tracks of support for Ukraine right now. You have the coalition of the willing format, and you have the money discussions. We have a long conversation around which one's more important. I think the money is more important, but Germany has been a leading figure in trying to get the money for Ukraine, not least because if we don't get it at a European level, it's going to be all Germany. And so, yes, Merz has been blamed for the failure of the European Council summit. I think, this was really, the December Council was a huge EU success of finding a compromise around a very difficult set of circumstances. It's a classic case of everybody is so ground down by the end of EU negotiations that nobody can really see it as the success that it is anymore. And of course, it's not the money that we were hoping for, but, Merz played a big role here in being once again willing to loosen a German taboo over joint European lending. And then on the coalition of the willing issue, it's really interesting because you obviously have France and the UK in the lead. You have France and the UK signing this bilateral declaration that they're willing to put the troops into Ukraine. You have Germany making a statement that they might be willing to consider, and that might be just troops in neighboring states, which if you want to be the leading conventional power in Europe, it's hard to imagine that if there is a coalition of the willing deployment in Ukraine, Germany is not going to be a part of it. But the fact that Merz is so much more cautious in his statements speaks to the cultural restraints and constraints that Christian was mentioning, I think. And it also goes to the fact that Germany will still put NATO force planning above everything for now, and that Germany is still saying all our troops are bound up in NATO force planning. If we take some of them out for a coalition of the willing deployment, doesn't that weaken NATO? So this is very much a work in progress in terms of how Germany is adapting some of its long-standing and deeply embedded strategic cultural assumptions, like the fact that we only deploy through alliances in real time. But one final point on German leadership is that it is not just a question of capability. It is also a question of how welcome is it really in Europe? And I'm going to say the thing that you're not supposed to say, because the conversation for the past few years has been what we fear more than anything else is a Germany that doesn't rearm. And we are all familiar with that conversation. I don't think that we can ignore the fact that in Poland, in some other European countries, there are now voices of concern over Germany rearming to the extent that it is. The Polish-German relationship being on the rocks is an untenable condition for the future of European defense, because Germany's rearmament really should be only for the benefit of Poland. That's why we're doing it. If we're not able to convey that message well, then we are testing this assumption that European integration and peace on the European continent was only possible under the umbrella of the United States, and that if the United
Yeah.
States takes on a weaker role, that there will again be tensions in Europe. I'm sorry for opening up this big theme, but I think if we're talking about Germany's role and German leadership, we have to also acknowledge that German leaders, who are very aware of this, are navigating an incredibly sensitive landscape here.
Just one thing to add to this, and just because of all this, what Sophia just mentioned, I think Europe becomes a necessity again. That doesn't mean the European Union. It doesn't, but how to basically bring partners back in and let them profit from it, not only on the military dimension, but also on the economic dimension, because there's a lot of money going now all over Europe, actually. And the question is, and this is another cultural gap that we have in Germany, how do you do strategic defense industrial relationship or defense industrial diplomacy? I mean, others have talked a long time about it. Not sure they have been so successful because they have a very national focus on what they are doing. The Germans implicitly have as well. But but at the same time, Europe is still a very important narrative. And I guess this is basically the thing. If Merz wants to be successful, not because he has said it, but because he needs to, and Germany wants to be successful, because it has to for the security of Europe, we basically have to bring the Europeans back in here. Whether that's through EU, whether that's through multilateral, bilateral agreements, doesn't matter. At the end, it will be a patchwork. But we can't forget them and let our industry do what they do, which is basically getting the biggest share of the cake for them.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. What you both said is just fabulous for our listeners to understand, to really get a nuance here. It's golly, we could go in so many different directions, but let me ask you a question. I wonder where when we think about this and all that we've said over the past, say, 25 minutes, NATO, it's like, well, what happens to NATO? Does it close? Does it remain open? But it's like the WEU, it meets every quarter, for coffee. I mean, so what happens to NATO as an institution? Let's put the U.S. out for right now. Let's just put it out. So so what happens to NATO? Is it going to be replaced eventually by something that's European? Is that where we're going? And so I say that because I wrote a piece with great colleagues from France and UK about the European pillar of NATO, and we put it out, I guess, a year or two ago, a little ahead of time. But talking about strengthening that European pillar of NATO. So my question to you all is, I'm wondering if there's not a way that we can rejigger NATO so that that becomes the house for the European army, if you will. It's the house for European security. It's more than a European pillar. It's the European. It's a foundation. Maybe the U.S. is a pillar somewhere, holding up the front door. I don't know, but I'm wondering if that helps take care of this issue of Germany alone, rearming, scaring Poland or whatever. It's better at pulling together for security the Southern Europeans with the North. Maybe that becomes the home that looks different than it did 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 50 years ago. But it's got the command structure, it's got the defense planning, it's got all the things that took NATO decades to build, and in a lot of ways still building. So you adapt that, and that becomes a European thing. And the U.S. maybe this will pull the U.S. back into it. Maybe we're still part of it, but the trust is gone. Sophia, you said that the trust. I can't see it coming back, even if we get a big Democrat coming in a couple of years, saying, let's go back to the old days. I mean, what fool would sit there and go, great, let's get all dependent again? So what do you think? Can NATO serve as an adapted NATO serve as the house to do European security?
I do not want to burn anything down that we don't need to burn down. There are so many useful structures and mechanisms inside NATO. We'd be fools to let it go and try to build something completely new in its place. I also think that the energy and the momentum for a European pillar inside NATO, ironically, cannot come from inside NATO. I think that NATO as an institution is so transatlantic in its very nature, core soul, that we can hope to make it more European over the coming years. I think that has to be the goal. But I don't think that process can originate within the institution. And I think that process is originating currently outside of the institution. I think, for instance, the Coalition of the Willing meetings, aside from what they're doing for Ukraine, we have European militaries meeting regularly to do joint force planning, in a large extent without the US, right? That looks to me like building the European pillar of NATO. Regional cooperation in the Northeast around capabilities, like the Patria vehicles, or the Navy fleet between the Norwegians and the Brits, or the JEF, or even Nordefco. All of that is building towards a European pillar inside NATO, strengthening that pillar. So I don't think that we start with a institutional rebalancing inside NATO. I think we have to strengthen European cooperation outside NATO and then hope that we can translate that momentum to the alliance.
As an operational entity, maybe. In other words, NATO, the NATO integrated military structure can be adapted to operationalize that European effort. In other words, shape, that if you can do what you said, and I think you're right, that all that organization comes from the outside and gets to a stage where, because they're also mainly NATO nations anyway, it translates within to the alliance, and then the alliance can muster it and use it, and there's not a duplicate outside of NATO that would do that. It would be NATO doing it.
I think it's actually the opposite. It's the other way around. Because would you, as a European, trust an infrastructure built on US IT systems? With an NSA just around the corner? Or would you start and rebuild, and I take the word, and duplicate the command structures? Because this is something you will have to possibly build it from scratch again. On the other side of the current headquarter, where the old headquarter stands, maybe that's an opportunity. I'm always eyeing over it. I thought maybe I should buy it so I can make a lot of money once it's around.
Yeah.
But, no, honestly, I think Jim, you hit basically the nail with pointing out that there is a vacuum currently in terms of we don't have the forum where all the Europeans meet. Yes, the Coalition of the Willing basically brings some of them together, but it's kind of NATO -1. So NATO minus the US currently can meet within NATO, and they do. They are closing the gap the US is leaving in terms of policy impulses. So the kind of, the positive role that the US for such a long time had as a policy entrepreneur and keeping NATO together. I think NATO has been going through the phase of the vacuum, and now they are basically developing their own way of doing it. Plus, I think, Sophia, you're absolutely right. There's a lot of standard operating procedures from NATO we can just take over because they're excellent. NATO is working in a routine way and as a very excellent bureaucracy, and I guess it's a very cheap one. We shouldn't possibly point that out, or maybe we should point that out to Trump. I think it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter to him. But I think that the political dimension we need, but with the political dimension minus the US, the question comes up whether we can still fight the way as we have thought with the Americans without the Americans. I guess the answer is no. Mm-hmm. And that basically brings you on the military strategic level to the question of what is the European way of war. I mean, right. if we can't offer air superiority as one of the main examples the US way of war is operating, that means we need to turn around a lot of things. We need to deliver a capability different, or we need a different war plan, which will impact on your command structure, also on the way how you execute strategy, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So this is basically, I don't want to put out a new ideal world out there, but I think this is the bigger challenge, especially if it is true that the US has walked out of the door already. Then even if the assets are still in Europe, they may no longer be for Europe. So I guess I'm coming back to just thinking out loud. The core question is whether the US is basically doing a cooperative walk out of the door and say we have to manage our assets. That's what grown-up people do, even if they divorce, or if they say, I don't care about anything and it's just a hostile partner, or even not a partner. It's a hostile actor, actually. So it really very much depends on. In the midterm perspective, I know in 5 years, you could have an opt-in opportunity that US can come in and will be invited, of course, if you see signs of improvement. But I think it is important to bear in mind that this egg basically has hit the floor already and it's broken and you can't put it back.
I guess as a last question, I don't know. I'm in listening to the conversation. I still feel of two minds. On the one hand, you both have laid out, so excellently all of the things that Europe is doing, the actions, the steps, the integrate. I mean, all of these things that you're talking about. At the same time, I'm still feeling, I don't even know how to put my finger on it, like there's still something missing, like that there's a disconnect here in what we're talking about, that there's still so many barriers and constraints and reasons why it might be difficult to translate the political will into the concrete actions. And I guess, again, just zooming back out at the end, how would you describe the way that you two, how you're feeling is not a great question for a national security podcast, but your degree of optimism that this is happening. So the second Trump administration has been a very significant shock. It should have brought this clarifying energy to Europe to move on and do things differently. Do you think it's happening, or are we still in an in-between world where, we used to hear a lot from some European allies that if we start filling these capabilities, if we take the steps, well, then we expedite the US withdrawal. So we don't actually want to do all those things. Like, where are we in that? Do you think that the Europeans have really departed? They're willing to build the capabilities, fill the gaps that the US leaves, even if it means then it's a very different relationship in the future? Or are we still a little bit in this purgatory in between world? I'm having a hard time articulating, but do you think there is a clarifying energy and the Europeans are moving with purpose to execute or not?
So I think you're asking such an important question, Andrea, and let me try to answer it. And we do now risk getting into the therapy session a little bit. But first answer, are we moving into a clarifying moment? Are Europeans stepping up? I do think the answer is yes. Why doesn't it feel like this? Right? I think is the second question. And it is striking to me how I can do the work that I do from DC. And if I don't go to Europe for a couple of months and I just look at the money being spent and the actions on the ground and the statements and the taboo after taboo after taboo that is broken and the huge strides that are being made in Europe, I can sit here and say, it's happening. And then you go to Europe and you talk to the Europeans, and it is impossible to not come back depressed. It's impossible. There's this sense of doom and gloom and what's not worth even trying, and we'll never get there. And I don't want to engage in too much sort of cultural essentialism, but I think there are two things happening here. One thing is that we have to acknowledge that if we are building a more European and less American defense, it's going to feel less American and it's going to feel more European. And that in part means less of a can-do attitude and more of a problem solving by problem solving. It's going to feel more like what it feels like in the EU, where you talk about all the things that don't work until the 11th hour, and then you find one compromise around it. And as I've said earlier, everyone's been so ground down by that point that it's hard to even recognize it as the success that it is, but it is a success. The other reason for why I think we have this divergence is that, and this goes back to this idea that Christian was talking about, the European way of war, it's not clear yet where we're landing and what we're building. And I think as long as we are beholden to this even phrasing of filling in the gaps that the US is leaving, I think we're having the wrong conversation. If we're measuring whatever Europe is doing by to what extent does that fill in what the US is no longer doing, I think it's always going to look like we're falling short, because we're not trying to build a new US leadership in Europe. We're trying to build an indigenous European defense, a European way of war that is going to, by necessity, look different. And so we have to, I think, adapt the standard by which we are measuring it, which is difficult because, as we've said many times now in many different ways, we're building the plane while we're flying it. We don't yet know where we're landing. We'll know it when we see it, 10, 15 years from now. But I think that's why maybe, Andrea, you're struggling, and I am struggling sometimes with this divergence between all the right things that are happening, and yet it doesn't feel like we're there yet.
I think Sophia's description of being puzzled is correct, and I guess the job of people like me who had basically the luxury of being grumpy about what has been delivered from Europe is basically now to turn around and say, look, this whole talk about we can't do it without the US is just wrong. But it is an internal therapy that we currently have when I talk to people and say what you say is just wrong. We can do without the US. It's just taking more risk, and it maybe look completely different. I think that's very important what Sophia just said. It's really from the start it looks different because you have to organize it in a different way, because the hegemonic power of the US will never be around again, even if the US comes back, because things will have changed in 4 years' time. And I think that's the important thing, is to really go into it gradually and say Europe can improve. The military power of Europe all put together is really something the Russians have to fear. Really, it's something where you can't say how the equation basically will turn out. And that's a good thing. And we can become even stronger. And it's possibly exactly this positive notion of basically leaving the old shores and say there is something new. And if we want to have a better future than it currently looks like, we just have to enter into it and just be positive about it. I'm just listening to myself and can't, am I saying this? But yes, that's the only way forward, because it's a kind of mixing responsibility with hope at that point. And I think that is something where the Europeans had the comfort for such a long time that we had outsourced all of that. And now those guys who basically have picked up the outsourcing, which is the US, basically say, it's over. This contract has just been cancelled, and there is no legal way to basically get it back. So, just live with it. and get over it and get it done. And I guess that's the biggest threat that the Russians basically can have, that the Europeans get over it. And I think what you currently see is that they are so much increasing their non-military activities, the active measures here in Europe just to split Europe more. They are afraid of that this could possibly happen. And to a certain extent, it's a big challenge to make this happening, just because the societies are already fragmented. But I think it's the only way ahead is to say, okay, there is hope, and it is doable.
This has been just fabulous. It's just fabulous discussion. But it really made me think, and I'm going to just throw this on the table. I've got to think it through. If it sounds just idiotic, I apologize, as I do often. But when we started NATO in 1949, it was Eisenhower. It was all of the guys. It was, the deputy, Westmore. Well, anyway, Montgomery. Montgomery was the deputy SACEUR. You had Eisenhower as the first SACEUR. You had the first SecGen was General what's-his-name. I mean, you had this American way of war put right into NATO as a template, because it was the Cold War. It was potting up. There was no time for a European way of war. There wasn't a definition for a European way of war. It had to be the way it was coming out of World War II. It was the same people who did World War II doing NATO. We were going up against the Russians, and that's what we did all the way until 1990. And in 1990, I was there. You guys were there too. But in 1990, we had a decision about, do you keep the American way of war, i.e. NATO, or is the Cold War over and the U.S. goes over here and Europe then takes on the European way of war? It would have to redo it the way you're describing it now. But what happened was, we stayed with NATO and the European way of war, and Europe wasn't able and was frustrated with trying to figure out, are we happy about this or not? Because everybody was cutting their budgets. The European way of war, if you looked at it from 1990 to 2000, was getting small, fragmentation, handling the Balkans. But it was still this American template on there. And it took Putin coming in and Donald Trump coming in to do exactly, Christian, what you were saying, which was, all of a sudden, this contract that had been there since 1949, that were renewed in 1990, all of a sudden, boom, the contract's over. And the European way of war suddenly is top of the pops. It should have been in 1990, 91, 92, 93. And it kind of was, because back then it was cut, get small. Now suddenly it's up to Europe. Okay, we're not even going to give you a transition. European way of war, good luck. And you got the Russians got a gun point. You're looking down the barrel of a Russian gun to build the airplane while it's still in flight. And if we had done it in 1990, 91, 92, 93, maybe we could have done that in a factory. Build a plane in a factory. But instead, we're doing it. And that's what's happened, I think, as you go forward in history. Sophia, when we have our class 50 years from now, and I'm up there drooling, I would say, maybe in the long term, keeping that American way of war, NATO, blah, 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 in 1990, maybe that was a mistake. We should have transitioned it into something else. Anyway.
Any last thoughts? Final words?
I'm amazed by how Christian and I managed to turn this into an optimistic flows, because we've done Brussels sprouts before, I think 1 or 2 times in this combination, and it's been always very European doom and gloom. And I'm glad that, I think Christian, and I'm half joking, but also I think we share the sense of part of European responsibility is also taking on what the US used to do, which is to sketch out the future and insert some hope. And that's also the responsibility of European think tankers now and European thinkers. So I'm glad that we did it here. Thanks for having us.
Yeah, nothing to add. I think Sophia is absolutely to the point. The responsibility is also down to us and to that little bit of influence that we can have on the conversation and trying to shape it to the right direction. And I guess that is maybe one kind of last thought on that. I think that is, since the last 3 years, basically the development for me personally, the melting of the professional life and the personal life in terms of thinking about the future of the next generation and your own kids basically drives you into that direction. And this is very much an existential phase. Europe as a whole, very abstract, but societies and individuals go through. People are afraid, and for a good reason they are afraid. And that's the only way Germany can spend so much money, and it's the only way possibly also, as you said, as the contract is over, to then have a European contract. And that's motivation enough to work on it.
Yeah.
But if we had done that 20 years ago, that would have made sense. 40
That's
years
water
ago.
under the bridge.
I know. But I think back to those days because I was so much involved in that. And I'm thinking, Jesus, anyway, I'm so sorry.
Well, we almost ended on an optimistic note, but I do think we'll bring it back to what Sophia and Christian said. I mean, there is an optimistic way forward. I think what we're missing from this conversation, Jim, and I think what we'll have to do in a future Brussels Sprouts is also the U.S. perspective. I mean, are we happy with just canceling the contract and saying over to you?
Right.
Or what is it that, future American thinkers need to be doing to shape the future of this relationship too? So I think we need, we've talked, this conversation was focused on the European piece, but I do think we need to have something that's focused on the US side as well. So
Absolutely.
Stay tuned, Brussels Sprouts listeners. We've got to round this conversation out. But for now, just a huge thank you to you, Sophia, and you, Christian. It's been a really wonderful, wonderful discussion.
You guys are great.
Thank you.
Absolutely
Thank you
great.
so much.
Thank you for listening to another episode of Brussels Sprouts, brought to you by the Transatlantic Security Team at the Center for a New American Security. You can find all of our previous episodes wherever you get your podcasts. And please remember to rate and review Brussels Sprouts so that new listeners are able to find the show.